I want to thank this year's organizers for inviting me to give this talk. I'm honored to be here with my esteemed colleagues. I'm going to talk about where are we with Paclitaxel coated devices in 2021. These are my disclosures, nothing pertinent for this talk. So we know that there have been several RCTs that have shown Paclitaxel coated balloons and stents significantly reduce the rates of vessel restenosis and target lesion revascularization after lower extremity interventions. The controversy really began in 2018 when Katsanos and his colleagues published a systematic review and meta-analysis of 28 RCTs investigating PCDs in the femoral popliteal arteries. They analyzed about 4,600 patients and showed that all-cause death at 1 year was similar between Paclitaxel-coated devices and the control arms, but was significantly increased and almost double at 2 years and 5 years. In addition, they found a significant relationship between exposure to paclitaxel and absolute risk of death, and concluded that there was an increased risk of death following the use of paclitaxel-coated balloons and stents in the femoral popliteal segments of the lower limbs, and further investigations were urgently warranted. At the time, many thought there was a rush to publish this analysis, even though it had flaws, and it was based on summary-level data and not patient-level data. In addition, patient numbers fell off significantly after 2 years, with many lost to follow-up. The causes of death were not reported in many of the studies, which were also not powered to study mortality long-term, and it did not compare different balloons and devices. In June of 2019, as a result of this analysis, the FDA convened a public meeting to discuss and determine recommendations on the topic of this late mortality signal. Industry even submitted patient-level data to the FDA for analysis, with a meta-analysis of these trials showing a late mortality signal in study subjects treated with paclitaxel-coated devices. Specifically, 3 pre-market approval RCTs included about 1,000 patients, in which the mortality rate at 5 years was 20% in patients treated with PCDs, compared to 13% in subjects treated with uncoated devices. This correlated with a 50% relative increase in mortality in patients treated with PCDs. Shortly thereafter, the Viva physicians performed another meta-analysis of patient-level data, which was provided by the manufacturers, and again this showed similar findings. As a result of this, recruitment was suspended for various trials, including Basel III, SWEDE PAD-1, and SWEDE PAD-2, and in August of 2019, the FDA published another letter which agreed that the magnitude of signal should be interpreted with caution because of multiple limitations in the available data, including wide confidence intervals due to a small sample size, pooling of studies of different PCDs that were not intended to be combined, substantial amounts of missing study data, no clear evidence of a paclitaxel dose effect on mortality, and no identified pathophysiologic mechanism for the late deaths. The FDA and panel concluded that additional clinical study data was needed to fully evaluate this late mortality signal. So where are we today? Since this last letter issued by the FDA in August 2019, investigators for a number of trials have published or publicly presented newly available long-term data showing no increased mortality signal. This has been supplemented by several analyses of Medicare patients, which also showed no evidence of increased mortality. And specifically, in September of 2019, the Levant 5-year patient-level data was presented in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology. Their analysis included data from Levant 1, Levant 2, Levant Japan, etc. And although there are approximately 3,000 patients in the Lutonix Global Femoral Popliteal Clinical Program, the primary analysis focused on the Levant 2 randomized data since it was the largest data set with the longest follow-up spanning approximately 5 years. Outcomes of this 1,000 DCB-treated patients were compared with 250 standard angioplasty patients. The analysis of this patient-level data showed no mortality difference between DCB and angioplasty. And there was no dose-response relationship when adjusted for key predictors of mortality. In November of 2020, the 5-year data from the Medtronic Impact Global study was also published in Circulation. This was a prospective, multi-center, single-arm study conducted at 64 international sites. It included about 1,800 patients in the DCB arm and 143 patients in the uncoated device or angioplasty arm. Their data showed all-cause mortality in the DCB arm was 15%, and in the angioplasty arm, 11%. There was no significant difference in mortality between the two groups, and no direct impact of paclitaxel dose exposure on survival status. And the authors concluded that based on this patient-level meta-analysis, which was independently adjudicated, there was no correlation between paclitaxel exposure and mortality through 5 years. Survival was not affected by mean paclitaxel dose. There was no difference in survival between paclitaxel dose levels, whether they were lower, mid, or in the upper range. Paclitaxel dose was not identified as a predictor of mortality by multivariable Cox regression model. And DCB patients who died were older and had more comorbidities. In 2020, the 1-year Ranger 2 SFA trial data was also published. Primary patency rate of DCB versus angioplasty at 12 months was 89% versus 72%, and this was statistically significant and based on Kaplan-Meier estimates. There was a significantly lower TLR when DCB was used compared to standard angioplasty, 6% versus 18% respectively. There was no difference in all-cause mortality at 12 months in the DCB arm compared to the uncoated balloon or angioplasty arm. Later that year, in December of 2020, an unplanned interim analysis of the Swede PAD trial data was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. This is a multi-center randomized open-label registry-based clinical trial. It included 1,149 patients randomly assigned to treatment with drug-coated devices and approximately 1,140 patients assigned to treatment with standard angioplasty. 1,480 patients had CLI and approximately 809 patients had intermittent claudication. The single endpoint was all-cause mortality. No patients were lost to follow-up during the 2.5-year study. No significant difference in the incidence of death between the DCB versus PTA treatment groups was seen. It was approximately 33% in the CLI patient population and approximately 10% in the intermittent claudication population. Finally, in January of 2021, new long-term safety data of the StellarX DCB was presented at the LINC meeting in Leipzig, Germany. This included approximately 600 patients in both Europe and the United States from 2 trials, including the Illuminate European RCT and the Illuminate Pivotal RCT. Over 90% of the patients complied with follow-up, and after 5 years, there was no significant difference in all-cause mortality among patients treated with the StellarX DCB versus standard angioplasty. So in conclusion, and based on the recent FDA letter in January of 2021, these newer analyses are showing that the mortality signal is not what we originally expected based on the Katsano's meta-analysis from 2018. The current data, as they said, is comforting and compelling, but the number of patients who have been followed to 5 years is still low, and therefore continued patient follow-up for ongoing RCTs is needed. For patients requiring endovascular treatment to relieve symptoms, they went on to say that PCDs improve blood flow to the legs and are more likely than uncoated devices to avert the need for repeat procedures. And they may be the best treatment for those judged to be at particularly high risk for restenosis and repeat femoral popliteal artery interventions. Additional data are needed to further refine the optimal treatment strategies for patients on the basis of their risk profile for restenosis, incorporating patient-specific and lesion-specific factors. And ultimately, it is up to us as the treating physicians to determine the best time to use paclitaxel-coated devices at this time. Thank you.